All right, gang, we're still inside the Preferences dialog box. If you okayed or escaped out and you need to rejoin me, then press Control-K or Command-K on the Mac to bring it up on screen. And next, I'm going to have you switch to the very next panel. And you could do that by choosing it from the list, of course. There it is, Type. Or, I just want you to note, you've got these Next and Previous buttons. So if I click Previous, I'm going to go back to General. If I click Next a couple of times, I'll advance to Type. Now, we're going to be revisiting this panel when we discuss how to create and format type inside of Illustrator because we will be adjusting these units. You can incrementally adjust the size and leading of selected text from the keyboard, but it happens in 2-point increments, which is too big for me. I usually change that to 0.5, but I'm not going to have you do that yet. We'll leave it set to 2 now. We'll come back to this. I want you to notice this checkbox right there, Type Object Selection by Path Only. It's a little strangely worded, but what it means is that you'll select any given type object only if you click on its path. And that's going to be the baseline associated with point text or the path outline associated either with area text, which you might think of as being a standard text block, or text on a path. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to make it easier to select things that aren't text. For example, remember back in the previous chapter when we sized the artboard and it was fitting to those big numbers? However, it was allowing room around the numbers above and below for potential ascenders and descenders, even though they didn't exist. Well, that behavior exists when you're trying to select objects inside of Illustrator as well. So you click on this imaginary descender, and it selects that letter or number that's not even in that location at all. And that can really get in your face after a while, in which case you'd want to visit this preference panel and turn on Type Object Selection by Path Only, which means that you're going to have to work a little harder to select type objects, but you're not going to have to work nearly as hard to select other objects inside of Illustrator. However, if you turn this checkbox on right now, it tends to make for a somewhat confusing interface. It's better if you turn it on after you gain a little more experience with the program. All right, I'm now going to have you switch to units. And this is where you control your units of measure. And notice that you have 3 different unit categories that you can select from. Now, we've already seen general. That's that same unit of measure that you can switch by right-clicking on the ruler tool. You can also set up the unit of measure when you create a new document. So some of you here in the States might prefer to work in inches. Those of you in other countries will probably prefer to work in centimeters or millimeters and so on. But even if you're in, for example, an EU country, and you decide to run with centimeters, you're still probably going to want to stick with points for both stroke and type because points has grown up as a convention for those attributes and objects. So, for example, all kinds of countries use points in order to measure strokes because, after all, points are very tiny increments, 1/72 of an inch. And type, as measured in points, is almost universal. So again, you might want to change general. You probably won't want to change the other 2. I'm going to leave general set to points. And that will, by the way, determine the default setting for any new document that you create, but you can override that. When you bring up the new document dialog box, you choose your preferred unit of measurement for that document only. Same when you right-click on the rulers. That affects that one document and nothing more. Finally, what I'm going to show you in this exercise anyway is plugins and Scratch Disk. There's nothing really to change in these other panels here, but plugins and Scratch Disk you may want to change. Now, if you work with additional plugins from third-party vendors, meaning not Adobe, you're the first party, Adobe's the second party, everybody else is the third party, then you can select this checkbox and choose the folder from which to load those plugins on your hard disk. It's unlikely you're going to do that, though. There aren't a ton of commercial Illustrator plugins out there these days. Scratch disks, however, you may want to change. Now, this is an adjustment you might want to make if Illustrator is performing poorly and you want to potentially increase the speed at which you work. The idea is that at a point, Illustrator runs out of room in RAM in your computer's memory, and it starts having to save various bits and pieces of your complex illustration to the hard drive. And that hard drive, by the way, is what's indicated by Scratch Disk. What hard drive are you going to use? Well, if you have multiple hard drives inside of your tower-style computer, so in other words, not your laptop, you're not going to change this setting if you're working with a laptop because you do not want to select an external drive, and otherwise you probably just have one drive inside of your laptop. But if you have multiple drives inside of a tower-style computer, most likely scenario, then you may want to switch the primary Scratch Disk to your secondary hard drive. That is a hard drive that you store data on, which is most likely going to be your D drive here on the PC. It could be whatever you call it on the Mac. And then you would set your C drive to the secondary drive. And the reason C is secondary is because C contains your operating system. It contains your Adobe applications by default. Illustrator and the OS, whether it's Windows or the Macintosh OS, is already constantly hitting that C drive. So you can take some of the pressure off things by having Illustrator hit the D drive first and then the C drive. However, I'm going to tell you this up front. This is by way of warning. You need to make sure that your permission settings are such that you can call up the D drive. Now, I've had terrible problems on the PC with that in the past. I've had to get my IT guy in here to help me if you're at all worried about it, because it can stop Illustrator from launching under the worst situation. That can be your worst case scenario. And then you have to hold down a bunch of keys when you launch Illustrator and reset it. Why then, if you're at all nervous about this, then just leave this option alone. However, if you're confident about your permission settings, then you can go ahead and change these guys right here. Note this cautionary icon. It's telling you that these changes will take effect the next time you start Illustrator. So it's not going to immediately switch Scratch Disk. It's going to change settings when you quit Illustrator and restart the program. Even though I know everything's set up properly on this machine, I'm going to switch primary back to startup and secondary to none, because everything's running pretty well here inside of Illustrator right now. In the next exercise, we will end things here inside the Preferences dialog box with a look at Rich Black.